Zhang Ziyi did not climb slowly toward recognition. She arrived fully formed, at a speed few actors ever experience. From her earliest international successes, she was not introduced as a promising talent but as a benchmark. Her performances were framed as proof of what Chinese cinema could be at its highest level. And with that framing, something quietly shifted. She was no longer measured against her peers. Her peers were measured against her. This distinction matters. When an actor becomes a standard too early, growth takes on a different shape. Mistakes are no longer interpreted as part of development but as decline. Experimentation becomes risk. Every role is expected to confirm an existing legend rather than explore something unfinished. For Zhang Ziyi, excellence did not open doors. It narrowed them. The industry reinforced this position willingly. Directors, critics, and institutions benefited from having a fixed reference point for quality. Zhang Ziyi became that reference. Her image stabilized into authority, controlled, reliable, unquestionable. Over time, she was less often seen as an actress in motion and more as a finished product. A conclusion rather than a process. This early canonization came at a cost that was not immediately visible. While other actors were allowed to fail, to disappear, to return transformed, Zhang Ziyi was expected to remain consistent. Reinvention would imply that the original standard was incomplete, and the system does not easily revise its own symbols. At the height of her recognition, she gained something rare, unquestioned legitimacy. But legitimacy, once fixed, can become a ceiling. Zhang Ziyi did not lose momentum because her abilities diminished. She slowed because the space to change was quietly taken away. To understand her later trajectory, one must first understand this moment, when success arrived too early and excellence became a role she was never allowed to step out of. Excellence is usually described as freedom. For Zhang Ziyi, it became containment. Once her reputation solidified, every new role arrived burdened with expectation. Audiences did not ask what she might become next. They asked whether she still met the standard she had already set. In that environment, progress was indistinguishable from repetition. This created a subtle paralysis. Roles that might have expanded her range carried the risk of disappointing a fixed image. Smaller projects appeared unnecessary. Imperfect characters felt incompatible with the authority she represented. The industry did not discourage experimentation openly. It simply stopped offering space where experimentation could exist without consequence. Zhang Ziyi's performances remained technically precise, emotionally controlled, and visibly disciplined. Yet that discipline also signaled stasis. Where other actors could use failure as a narrative turning point, she was denied that luxury. A single misstep would not be framed as exploration, but as evidence of decline. The margin for error narrowed until it almost disappeared. This is the hidden cost of early canonization. Growth requires instability. It demands periods of uncertainty where outcomes are unclear. Zhang Ziyi's career, however, was stabilized too soon. The system had already decided who she was meant to be, and stability became more valuable than evolution. As a result, excellence stopped functioning as a pathway and became a checkpoint. She could maintain her position, but not easily move beyond. Each role reinforced her legitimacy while quietly reinforcing the boundaries around her. Over time, this balance transformed from achievement into constraint, setting the stage for a career defined less by reinvention than by preservation. As Zhang Ziyi's career matured, her image shifted from performer to authority. She was no longer presented primarily as an actress exploring roles, but as a figure who embodied judgment, legitimacy, and standards. Invitations reflected this change. She appeared as a juror, a representative, a symbol of seriousness. The industry began to treat her less as someone in motion and more as someone who had already arrived. Authority brings visibility of a different kind. It grants respect, but it also fixes perception. When an actor becomes an authority, their identity hardens. They are expected to uphold the values they represent rather than challenge them. For Zhang Ziyi, this meant that each appearance reinforced her role as a guardian of quality rather than a participant in creative risk. This transition subtly altered how her work was received. Performances were no longer evaluated on their own terms. They were assessed against the weight of her reputation. The question was no longer whether a role was interesting, but whether it was worthy of her status. This framing left little room for vulnerability, contradiction, or failure. The authority she carried did not belong entirely to her. It was co-owned by the system that elevated her. Institutions relied on her stability to validate their own standards. As a result, deviation became undesirable. Reinvention would not only reshape her image, it would destabilize a reference point the industry depended on. In becoming an authority, Zhang Ziyi gained permanence but lost fluidity. Her career entered a phase where change was perceived as risk rather than necessity. What once signaled mastery now functioned as a constraint. Authority became her identity, and identity, once fixed, left little space for transformation. Consistency is often praised as professionalism. In Zhang Ziyi's case, it became a cage. Once her image settled into authority, the industry demanded that she remain unchanged. Each role was expected to confirm what was already known, not challenge it. The idea of reinvention, so essential to artistic longevity, quietly became incompatible with her position. This expectation was not enforced through prohibition but through framing. A role that deviated too far from her established image would not be seen as exploration. It would be read as regression. A quieter performance might be labeled underwhelming. A rougher edge could be dismissed as loss of control. The system left her with only one safe direction: forward along a narrow, predetermined path. What made this cage effective was its invisibility. Zhang Ziyi was never told to stop changing. She simply learned that change carried disproportionate consequences. Where other actors could afford to be inconsistent, she could not. Consistency became proof of legitimacy, and legitimacy became something that had to be protected at all costs. Over time, this dynamic reduced choice without reducing responsibility. Zhang Ziyi remained accountable to an image she no longer actively shaped. Each decision had to align with a legacy that was already complete in the public imagination. The past became an obligation, rather than a foundation. In this way, the cage of consistency did not diminish her standing, preserved it. But preservation came at the expense of renewal. Her career continued, stable and respected, yet increasingly constrained by the very excellence that once propelled her forward. Unlike many of her peers, Zhang Ziyi does not have a comeback narrative. There was no dramatic fall, no disappearance that demanded rediscovery. And that absence is precisely the point. Reinvention in Cbiz is often permitted only after collapse. Falling creates permission. Zhang Ziyi was never allowed that release. Her career unfolded under a different logic. Because she never visibly failed, the system never recalibrated its expectations of her. She was required to remain complete at all times. A comeback would imply that something had been lost, that the standard she represented was temporary or flawed. For the industry, that implication was unacceptable. As a result, Zhang Ziyi was locked into continuity. She could move forward, but only within parameters that preserved her symbolic authority. Risk-taking roles became difficult to justify. Starting over was impossible without undermining the image that sustained her legitimacy. The space where reinvention usually happens between decline and return never opened for her. This explains the strange flatness observers sometimes perceive in her later trajectory. It is not stagnation caused by lack of skill, but by lack of permission. The system needed Zhang Ziyi to remain Zhang Ziyi, not evolving, not uncertain, not unfinished. A figure who reassures rather than questions. In this context, her career choices become easier to understand. Stability was not a lack of ambition. It was the only viable strategy. Zhang Ziyi did not resist reinvention. Reinvention was structurally unavailable to her, and that limitation reveals how power operates most quietly, not by denying success, but by fixing it in place. Zhang Ziyi's story does not resolve with decline or revival. It resolves with recognition. Her career reveals a paradox at the center of Cbiz. The industry celebrates excellence, but struggles to accommodate those who embody it too completely. When an actor becomes a standard, they cease to be allowed the instability that growth requires. Her experience shows that authority in entertainment is not neutral. It carries expectations that narrow possibility. The system depends on stable symbols to define quality, and once those symbols are established, change becomes a threat. Zhang Ziyi was elevated, preserved, and constrained by the same mechanism. This does not diminish her achievements. It reframes them. Her consistency is not evidence of creative stagnation, but of structural limitation. She did not fail to reinvent herself. Reinvention was never part of the role she was assigned. The industry did not need her to evolve. It needed her to remain credible. What her career ultimately reveals is the cost of becoming the benchmark. Early canonization can function as a ceiling, not a foundation. Excellence, when fixed too soon, turns into expectation, rather than possibility. Zhang Ziyi's path reminds us that success is not only about reaching the top, but about retaining the freedom to move once you are there. In an industry obsessed with momentum, her stillness tells a different story. One where stability is not safety, and where the greatest constraint is not failure, but the inability to change.